Hi, I'm Allie from the Potomac Bead Company, and I'm going to talk about our Basic Beading class. This is a great refresher if you've taken the class or if you've been doing it a while and just need some suggestions. So for the Basic Beading class, when people come into the store, I'm assuming that they're starting out completely fresh and that they've never done any beading before. What I'm going to do is point them in the direction of looking at the bead board to start out. When I'm looking at the bead board, it helps to give measurements and designs for working with your necklace. The bead board here, I'm using also the different channels to kind of store my different items that I'm using. The first thing you want to think about is whether or not you want a pendant for your necklace. If you want a pendant, that is the focal point. That's going to be laying at the 0, which is the bottom of the necklace, and you'll want to pick that out first because that's going to really make your piece. In addition to your pendant, you do want to pick out 2 strands of beads. The 2 strands of beads can be the same size, different size. I usually like a different size and a different shape. Right now, I am working with round beads and then also rondelle beads. These beads I've laid out on my bead board in a pattern fashion. Additionally, I'm using some silver, and I always add that last. If you're not going to work with the pendant, you do want to look for a bigger bead to work with as well. In addition to the bead board, the other thing that I'm going to be working with is bead stoppers. The bead stoppers stop the beads from falling off the wire when I'm working with them. The bead stoppers, all I do is I pull back on the back of the stopper and it opens up the different sections for me to link onto my wire. When I'm doing this also, I'm going to be using crimp beads and a clasp as well as some crimp covers. The tools that I'm going to be working with are a wire cutters and a flat nose pliers. You can also choose to use a beading pliers or a crimping pliers when you're working with that as well. Lastly, the wire selection that I've chosen and that I do for most of my classes is 49 strand beading wire. 49 strand wire is going to be the most flexible wire, and it's also going to keep its shape better. The 49 strand wire means that there are 49 pieces of cable that are twisted together to make the actual wire itself. The 49 strand, like I said, is the most flexible, and the standard size that I use is a 0.018. If you have beads that are really tiny or sometimes beads that have small holes, you may need to use a thinner wire like 0.015. If you have beads that have a bigger hole and are heavier, you may want to bump up to a 0.012 or 21 or a 0.024. So that's how I design the beads, and then I'll show you the finishing techniques that I use after I begin to string. Once you have your design laid out, you're going to use wire cutters to cut wire before stringing. The wire you're going to cut is going to be the length of your project plus an additional 6 inches. You're then going to attach your bead stoppers and string your project onto your wire. When you're stringing your project, you want to just start with one end and string the whole way around to the other end of your project. And as you pick up the beads will go onto your beading wire. When you get done stringing your necklace or your bracelet, if you're working on a bracelet, what you're going to be using is crimp beads and pliers. I will show you how to use crimp beads in your clasp and attach those to the end of your necklace. Once I'm done stringing again, I'm going to be putting on my crimp beads. To put on my crimp beads and to put on my closure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on one of my crimp tubes, run the wire through the crimp tube, through my clasp, and then run the wire back through the crimp bead. Then I'm going to use a flat nose pliers or a chain nose pliers to squash down and make that crimp tube flat. I will then be assembling a crimp cover over that crimp bead. To do this, what you want to do is pick up your wire, put on one of your crimp tubes onto your wire. Once the crimp tube goes onto your wire, you're going to make sure that it drops down next to your beads. If the crimp tube is floating away from your beads, you're going to have extra wire exposed on your project, which you do not want because you don't want any wire exposed if you're beading the whole thing. I'm going to put on my ring now. The ring is going to float on the wire, and I'm going to fold the wire back through the crimp tube and back through the next couple beads if I can. When you're doing this, you do want to make sure if you're using a lobster and a ring, that when you're using that, you want to use a split ring or a closed ring. You don't ever want to have an open ring, or what that's going to do is come out of your project. You're going to run that wire again back through the crimp tube, back through the next couple beads, and then we're going to flatten it out. I'm going to pull that wire, and then to flatten out the wire, what we're going to do is we're going to use our flat nose pliers. I'm just going to give that a little pinch, and once it's pinched, it's going to be closed. Then what I'm going to do is pick up my ends and put on knot cover or crimp covers. The crimp covers just look like little tiny beads and they look like they have an opening to them. You're going to put that around your crimp tube. And then what you're going to do is close that up so that it does look like a bead. The opening is going to go around your crimp tube, and then you're going to squeeze it shut with your flat nose pliers. If you decide to use a beading pliers or a crimping pliers, you don't necessarily need the crimp tube, and the crimp tube is just a little added look, so that way when you're looking at your finished product, it looks like a bead and not just the crimp tube. That's going to be the way to finish off your project when you're just doing basic beading.